going to start the meeting now. Thanks very much to everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Colin Coulter. I teach in the Sociology Department in Maynooth, one of the organisations that's putting together this event this evening. The topic we're here to discuss this evening is the almost textbook rhetorical question: is Ireland a tax haven? And there's a specific reason for this particular question, of course, that's been on many people's lips for a long period of time. But the reason we're talking about it now is because of the recent publication of this fantastic book. I'd like to recommend to everybody Tax Haven Ireland by the two authors who'll be speaking this evening, Brian O'Boyle and Kieran Allen. It is a fascinating work, making the case that Ireland is indeed a tax haven, setting that out in forensic detail, tracing it back historically, looking at the ideological imperatives, the economic interests that are served by the particular tax regime, fiscal regime maintained by the Irish Republic. I think it's a landmark work in many respects. Not least, I think it's indicative of something that's happened over the last dozen years or so since the great financial crisis crash, which is the emergence of a radical political economy in Ireland. And I think it's a book that certainly I think everybody across the political spectrum should really take it upon themselves to go out and read. I'd also like to congratulate Pluto Press, who not for the first time have brought out a book on Ireland that is available at an affordable price. And indeed, later on in today's discussion, we'll be telling people how they can get access to the book at that affordable price. So we have four speakers in tonight's event. As I mentioned already, we have the two authors, Brian O'Boyle, who teaches in St Angela's in Sligo, Kieran Allen, who teaches in the Sociology Department in UCD University College Dublin. We also have two respondents who have read their work and are going to participate in the discussion tonight. We have Mary Cosgrove, who is from NUI Galway, who has extensive background and expertise in tax both in Ireland and internationally. And we have Sorley McCaughey, who until recently was working for Christian Aid and is now working for an organisation, an NGO called Human Act, who are engaged in various projects to diminish poverty, not least through advocacy for the introduction of a global wealth tax. So before we go into the discussion, I just want to issue a few thanks to the Sociology Department for the Social Science Institute in Maynooth, and also to RIFT, which is a new group of left academics organised under the platform, under the banner of Research in Ireland for Transformation. Anybody who's interested in the work of RIFT, I'll come back to at the end of today's discusussion to give you details of how you might get in contact with us. Most importantly, I'd like to thank Anne and Orla in Moosey, the Social Science Institute here out in Maynooth, who, as on several occasions before, have given me huge amounts of help with the mechanics of putting this together and facilitating the kind of the smooth organisation of this evening's discussion. So that's merely by way of introduction. I want to start with Kieran, and then we'll move to Brian. I want to ask a couple of questions because quite often the discussion on tax havens exists at a level of generality. Quite often it exists without an historical context, quite often exists perhaps in the most generalizable terms. And what I want to suggest is that perhaps we could begin the discussion by getting into some of the fine detail of the book that you have put together yourself and Brian. And I want to ask two questions. The first to yourself, Kieran. What's the kind of genealogy of the status of Ireland as a tax haven? Where does it come from? What are the key landmarks? How would you kind of trace it out? Because in the book, one of the things that I think is very impressive is the way in which you trace that genealogy way back to the 1950s and trace it also to the attempts of the state to facilitate the tax evasion of the domestic rich, which we'll come back to later. So Kieran, could you maybe just set out some of the kind of key staging posts for the emergence of tax haven Ireland, as you put it in the book?
Okay, welcome. First of all, thanks, Colin, for organising this, and thanks in particular to RIFT and the School of Sociology in Maynooth. I think in order to understand this genealogy, I think there's really two things you need to understand about Ireland. First of all, we have a weak capitalist class, and a capitalist class that didn't set up factories, didn't, if you like, partake in an industrial revolution, and therefore looked on the state as very much directly helping it to make profits and so on. And secondly, we've always had what I would consider a bloated upper professional class with a deep sense of entitlement stemming from the British Empire right to today, in fact. Now, what is the genealogy of tax havens specifically, if we take that into account? Well, first of all, when the Irish state is established, as De Valera called it, it's an outgarden of Britain. There was no real attempt to build up Irish industry. It relied on essentially agricultural exports to the former metropolitan empire. And then from 1932 to 58, you get the strategy of protectionism, where high tariff barriers are set up to help Irish capital grow behind those barriers. And really that comes to an end really around the key moment, obviously, is 1958. But even before that, you find there are discussions often linking, if you like, elements of American business to the Irish Department of Finance. And the proposal that comes up, I think in 1956, was to bring in an export profit relief tax, whereby tax was cut by 50% initially and then effectively cut in total. So this is the beginning. So the idea of attracting multinationals in from the onset is linked to the idea of tax relief and giving them special tax concessions and so on. Now, I suppose that is really, and you trace the period of the 60s, more tax concessions are added in for depreciation of capital, machinery, and so on. I suppose the second moment I would highlight would be the emergence of Charles Haughey. And particularly for a younger generation, the story of Haughey, I mean, in many ways, it demands a retelling. I mean, this is a man that was able to accumulate 45 million in bribes, that's what they are. He set up a system, the Ansbacher account, which looked after 180 of the richest people in Ireland who were able to put their money into what appeared to be an offshore account. In reality, it was the Guinness Mahon bank. And so therefore we have from the start the notion that the Irish wealthy that taxes were for little people. Irish wealthy weren't supposed to pay taxes. And if you look at the figures, by the way, for Irish corporations, the tax rate of corporations, Irish owned industry, you find is still to this day extraordinarily low. So I think the Haughey is a key moment. And then the next key moment, I think, really is in the mid 80s with the formation of the Irish Financial Services Centre, which arises mainly because of the Big Bang in Britain, because of Thatcher and eventually Reagan removing all controls on the flow of capital. But really the key moment comes later than that, which is the Tax Consolidation Act of 1997, which sets up Ireland as really a centre for special purpose vehicles, for essentially the creation of hedge funds, for shadow banking, so that Ireland essentially becomes eventually a key place where money is brought in for tax evasion. And the last, if you like, element of that, in many ways, is when what we can, with the term we use deliberately, is tax dodging, rather than the so-called distinction between evasion and avoidance. Tax dodging really comes home really after the crash of 2008, where the rules about Section 10 are applied to property in order to bring in some of the mutual funds, the vulture funds into Ireland, who are allowed to buy up property on the cheap, first of all, obviously, but secondly, without paying much tax. I mean, in some cases, paying as little as maybe 250 euros for quite big property deals. So I would say that in many ways, the tax dodging, which began looking after the Irish wealthy, moved on to the multinationals, has literally come back home in terms of its impact on the property, on the housing crisis in Ireland, with all the consequences that people, I think, know about today.
Okay, thanks very much, Kieran. And some of those issues, particularly the importance of intellectual property in various schemes of tax avoidance, evasion, dodging, whatever you want to call it. That's a theme we'll come back to in the very near future. Thanks, Kieran. I just wanted to bring Brian O'Boyle in now. I mean, one of the difficulties with this kind of debate is quite often some of the numbers and some of the concepts and some of the practices are so vast and so complex. It can be very hard for people to get their heads around, and sometimes you it's hard to avoid the kind of suspicion that perhaps people aren't meant to get their heads around. I mean, one of the figures you give in the book, I think from Richard Murphy, is that total tax evasion in the world is 3.98 trillion, the size of the domestic economy of Germany, which is kind of unthinkable. And we hear these terms, the green jersey and the single malt and the Dutch sandwich, and more recently, I think there was the green jersey. I think the more recent one. Do you want to maybe give us a kind of practical illustration of how this works for people who maybe, unlike the speakers here, don't necessarily have a strong background in economics or kind of tax practice?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And again, thanks to yourself, to Mussie and to Rift for putting on the event. Yeah, so look, I mean, the way to understand it, I think, is to get your head a little bit around the nature of global capitalism today. If you go onto a website called Orbis, which is hosted out of Switzerland, they have a kind of a website that shows you all the various major companies and their various arms and sort of subsidiaries. And what it shows is that capitalism is becoming increasingly centralized, where fewer and fewer companies are controlling more and more of the global system, but they also fragment themselves strategically. So some of the examples we give in the book, HSBC Bank, and we're not talking about branches now, we're talking about legal entities. They have 828 actual companies within the corporate group, stationed across 71, I think it is, or 72 countries. You know, we find Budweiser, again, something like 628 branches across 60 countries. So why do they do that? They do that because it gives them a whole series of advantages. Number one, they can hedge. So they can decide, you know, we want to put some things here. People probably have heard about, you know, global supply chains at this stage through COVID. So one of the features is you set up a global supply chain, but you also set up very strategic ways of moving your money around. You also set up a form of secrecy because you can put very valuable assets in various places. Well, you know, think about it in just simple terms. If you're an accountant and you have one set of accounts to look at, that's a lot easier than trying to sift through 828 companies within a group, you know, separated out into different jurisdictions with different legal systems and all the rest of it. So what they do is they play on the fact that they can move internationally around the place. Okay, so that's a really important background point. Now, how does the kind of mechanisms work? Well, I would say there are probably three primary ones. Okay, so the first one is that one arm of the group, usually the internal financing operation, is able to sort of give loans to other aspects of other companies within the group in a very circuitous, complex way. What happens then is down the other end of the chain, those companies go off and do their business. They may make profits, and if they do make profits, before they pay their profit tax, they declare that they have costs. Now, costs are legitimate enough. You know, you pay your costs before you pay your profits. But of course, when you go and check where those costs are, the costs are being paid back to themselves. So the company is lending money to itself effectively, and then using that as a cost in the tax code to get a tax deduction. That's one. That's loan manipulation is the way we phrase that, right? Second one is about trade. So again, people don't really understand, like it's you know, unless you look at this stuff, between 50 and 80% of all global trade now happens inside companies. So these major global corporations, most of what they're doing is trading with each other, with their own arms and with other arms and with smaller companies. And eventually then there's some trade happens with the general public, but a lot of trade happens inside companies. And you see, the company is meant to apply what's called an arm's length principle, which means it's meant to charge itself as if it was trading on the open market with other people. So if they were going to buy, you know, a computer and it was worth €1,000 on the open market, if they buy it from themselves, they should also charge themselves €1,000. But of course, it's, you know, it's very difficult when there's no actual market price to really police that properly. And so what companies have been able to do is evolve strategies whereby they undercharge themselves in low tax jurisdictions and they overcharge themselves in high tax jurisdictions, so that when it comes to it, this is called transfer pricing. So you transfer it across the various arms of the company. Again, you notice that you have to be a big multinational to be able to do a lot of this stuff. And so transfer pricing is another one. Now, one sort of subsection of that, that's a specialty that has become more and more important in modern global capitalism, is using intellectual property as the basis upon which you transfer price. So in the book, we give the example of a company, a traditional company that might be selling machinery. that company maybe, you know, spent what I say is like €1 million on a machine that could anchor their production for 10 years. If we assume that it depreciates in a linear fashion, that's 10 years, 1 million divided by 10 is €100,000. So if they're making profits in any year, they would legitimately be allowed to knock €100,000 of cost off their profits. And that would have been the way, you know, tax law operated. And as I say in the book, you know, you could, you know, challenge that on the basis that workers who go back to college don't get money off their, you know, if they invest in their futures. But no, nonetheless, there was some basis for it. But in modern capitalism, a lot of the assets that they're using are intellectual property, software, brands, logos. You know, the Starbucks. What does Starbucks really have? They have a brand. That's what they're actually selling under. And so it becomes almost impossible, next to impossible, to actually get beyond those two layers. Number one, you're using intellectual property, which is very hard to value. And number two, it's all done under transfer pricing, what I just spoke about a minute ago. So what happens is that companies can really almost make up the prices that they say they're going to charge. And again, what that allows them to do is all sorts of complex things. One, for example, and I'll finish up on this, for example, in Ireland, is that Apple Incorporated in 2015 brought about 320 billion quids worth of intellectual property into Ireland, which we don't know where it was actually valued. We don't know how much it was really worth. But from now on, they're allowed to use that every single year to reduce their tax bill to zero. So until they make 320 billion quid in profits, their tax bill in this state will be zero. So that's basically the mechanisms they use. They play themselves off against other governments, and they use those mechanisms to reduce their taxes.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. I mean, there's so many things in the book. I mean, one of the things that I must say I hadn't seen before was that apparently multinational corporations can write off their losses anywhere in the world, in Ireland as well. Something which I think the figure you give in the book is something like that takes about 5 billion off the amount of profit that is amenable to tax. At this point, Sorley or Miri, is there anything you would want to respond to? I'm going to bring you in a moment to talk about the Apple case, but is there either of you want to come back to Kieran or Brian to echo what they've said, to contest what they've said? Sorley, you're muted there.
Yeah, no, I was going to compliment them both on the introduction, which they've managed to capture what was really complex stuff very, very well and very easily. I mean, what Brian was saying about the mechanisms by which corporations are able to move profit around essentially is so key to it, and it was why for Christian Aid back in 2008, the issue of country by country reporting was so important, and that's essentially a transparency measure, which would have thrown open exactly where companies are making their profit, making their sales, hold their assets, have their employees. And not surprisingly, and as is mentioned in the book, this is a measure that has been quite strongly opposed by the Irish government over the years. They had to concede that through the OECD BEPS process, it was going to happen, but they have held very strong in ensuring that that information is not publicly available. So that's what Brian has spoken about is really key to it and has real kind of resonance in an Irish context.
Absolutely. Miri, thanks very much. Sorry, Miri, would you like to come in at that point?
Hi, yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, it's quite upsetting when Kieran's talking about things I remember clearly and he's having to explain them to the young ones as history, which makes me feel a tad old. Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, congratulations to both of them on, I suppose, quite an accessible book. It's not really, you know, not only in price, but in terms of how it's written and the story is told. And just, I thought, interesting, sort of avoids getting bogged down in the academic debate about what exactly is a tax haven, how does that, what is the definition of it, what is an agreed meaning of it, provocatively called a tax haven Ireland. But I think the story it's telling more, and the story that they've introduced to us, is more when we as Irish citizens look at some of the tax structures our state have facilitated. Is this something we're proud of, or are there many things in there that we're ashamed of, that kind of just don't pass the smell test? And in particular, I thought the chapter on the fixers really resonated with me as somebody who worked in a tax section of a Big Four firm for a long time. And the phrasing there about the quotes from people about, you just don't think about it when you're working in there. And when we see public debates on this, it can get really technical. People saying, you know, you don't understand the terms, you don't understand how this works. But I think it's really important to take that step back and say, but overall, are we proud of it? And I've sat in lawyers' offices while we waited for confirmation from a number of banks that millions of euros had run around between a number of bank accounts, exactly as Brian was describing, to create an artificial tax deduction. And at that time, I can tell you, I thought nothing wrong with it. I just felt I was doing my job as a professional, reducing my client's tax bill. And, you know, I've left that. I'm now in academia. I have the benefit of being able to take that step back. But the rules that we have, the laws we have, are implemented by our politicians, by our legislators, and it shouldn't just be the lawyers and the accountants and the multinational firms who decide whether or not this is acceptable. So this sort of book that, as I said, tells a story in very accessible terms can help the rest of the public decide, is this something we want to stand for? Is this how we want Ireland to operate?
Thanks very much, Miri. Yeah, I mean, it's told in an incredibly vivid and accessible way. That chapter on the fixers is will live long in the memory. And I suppose again goes back to perhaps what Kieran was talking about at the beginning, that kind of golden circle within Irish society that connects the kind of domestic professions capital and international capital. If I could just move the discussion along a little bit. I mean, some of the kind of eye-watering detail in the book. Apparently, if the profits which multinational corporations register in Ireland are to be believed, everybody working for them is generating value added of about 700,000 euros a year. Those working in the American multinational sector are producing every year an annual added value of 1.5 million euros. The multinationals are registering something like 180, 283 billion in Ireland, and 111 of that basically magically disappears before the revenue gets involved. But all of those kind of headline kind of figures are kind of hard to get your head around. The one that brought it home to everybody globally and domestically was, of course, what happened in the summer of 2016, of course, with that moment in July of the leprechaun economics, 26.3% GDP growth, and of course, close on its heels at the end of the summer, the European Commission's ruling on Apple, and it's suggesting that Apple owed Ireland, or at least owed somebody, 13,000 million euros in unpaid taxes. But of course, what it appears is that the Irish state has been vindicated, or what we're told is the Irish state has been vindicated. And in league with Apple, it has appealed the European Commissioner's ruling, and that its reputation has re-emerged unsullied. Is that a version of events? Let's maybe start with Brian and Kieran, and we'll work back to Miri and Sorley. I mean, what's the significance of the Apple case, and is this something that's going to come back to haunt all of the major players in it? Perhaps Brian, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, look, the thing about the Apple case is it's full of contradictions in ways, because on the one hand, right, so it starts with the European Commission, who after a painstaking report, and they got a lot of their information from a Senate inquiry in America, which actually had some teeth, they decide that Ireland is guilty of giving unfair tax advantages, which distorted competition. It was the competition, you have to remember, it was the Commissioner for Competition, and inside the EU, a neoliberal EU, it pays a lot of lip service to the importance of competition. And so free market competition is meant to be key. And they're challenging the Irish state on the basis of its free market or its distortion of that market, right? So how do they say it happens? What they say is that there are two basically front companies. And as Mary said, you don't want to get too technical. So there are two front companies established. And those two front companies are established in order to allow vast amounts, we're talking hundreds of billions over the decades, to come through the Irish state. And when they come into the Irish state, they're bounced. Ireland acts almost like a trampoline. They get bounced off to a head office, which turns out to be nowhere. Now, if it's nowhere, it can't pay tax, because you have to be in some jurisdiction to pay your taxes. So that's the kind of initial position, right? Now, What the Irish state comes along and says, and by the way, it used a guy called Paul Gallagher, who used to be the Attorney General. So their argument is basically, let's accept one part of this case in order to defend ourselves. You know what they say? They go off to Europe and they say, listen, the European Commission are telling us to collect 13 billion, but it's not our money because the profits weren't made here. That's what they said. That's their defense. Their defense was we shouldn't be collecting that money because there was no value added in Ireland. The value was all added in America, and you shouldn't be, Ireland's not entitled to take that money. And then the European judges say, or the European Commission have not proven their case because they haven't proven that the profits should be taxed in Ireland. But this is where your head starts to spin, because why would they be taxed in Ireland in the first place? They weren't produced in Ireland. So then the question becomes, well, why were these front companies set up at all? If the profits weren't made in Ireland, if the value wasn't produced in Ireland, why were the profits ending up in Ireland at all? I mean, that's the question that's left hanging, pregnant in the air. And just to put some icing on that cake, it turns out that the way they were initially setting themselves up, Apple, they had a licensing agreement so that they could send the profits out of Ireland. Since 2015, the profits indeed do end up in Ireland, and the value still isn't produced in Ireland. We're still in a situation where, no company in Ireland actually produces this value. And yet now Ireland, Apple are declaring billions and billions and billions of profits in Ireland, even though there's no value being produced in Ireland. But of course, now they're getting a capital allowance of 100% on the profit, so they're not paying any profit tax. So the point of it is that actually the Irish state has accepted in a roundabout way that the profits should not have been in Ireland. And they paradoxically, well, maybe it just shows you how corrupted the whole bloody European system is. They've won their case by saying the profits shouldn't have been here in the first place.
Yeah, they managed to shift the goalposts from an argument which was about competition and the abuse of competition law to something which was about who had the right to impose these taxes. Thank you, Brian. Kieran, do you have anything you want to add about Brian?
I just add three very short points. I mean, just think about it. It's quite extraordinary in a number of ways. Number one, what other country would pay its top legal firms quite a lot of money, a few million, to stop its people getting 13 billion? I mean, you can think of paying money to a law firm to get some money, but to stop money that's been handed to you, it's quite extraordinary. Secondly, it's also, when you look at the actual details of the case, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but multinational corporations, unlike workers, can go in and talk to the revenue commissioners and have a discussion under what's known as advanced pricing agreements. In other words, begin to have a discussion, well, how much tax will we pay? What's interesting about the Apple case, and this emerges from the minutes that the European Commission gets hold of, is that Apple sends in its tax advisor and says, right, we want to pay less than 2%. We recognize this, I'm quoting from the minutes, this is not a scientific figure, but essentially make it up so that we pay less than 2%. And then lastly, in order, Apple being such a greedy company, having paid less than 2%, and by the way, paid less than 2% since 1980, the EU Commission only looked at 10 years. In fact, Apple's been in this country for 35 years, so the figure is much more than 13 billion. But having gotten agreement to pay less than 2%, it then goes back to the revenue commissioners and says, this is too much for us. We want to reduce our tax bill further so that by 2014, the tax rate on Apple profits in Ireland is, and I'm quoting here, I have to get my figures right, 0.005% rate of tax. I mean, this is absolutely extraordinary stuff. And you compare that, again, please go back and compare it to what a worker does in putting in their tax returns or paying PAYE. You don't get to negotiate with the revenue commissioners on this sort of tax.
Thanks very much, Kieran. I mean, again, for those of us who don't have heads for figures, I mean, 0.005%, the figure that Kieran cited there, works out as €5 for every 100,000 euros of profit, which on the basis of an average income in Ireland of 37,000 euros means if the same rate of tax applied to PAYE workers and ordinary working people, they would pay something in the region of €1.70 a year. Something in that nature, yeah. So anyway, can we bring Mary in there? Anything you would like to add or contest or
yeah, a couple of things, I suppose, despite the headlines and the statements from the Department of Finance when the decision came, where the commissioner's decision was overruled. I don't think Ireland or Apple have come out unsullied from this. The key figures still stand. The amount of money funneled through Ireland still stands. But there was lots of really interesting information in that original report and the minutes that they had. And, you know, I have to express some sympathy for the position the Irish state and the revenue commissioners took on that initially. It was very clear from those from the minutes back from the early 80s that there was a meeting where it was held where basically Apple went in with their advisors and said, we're looking at a global restructuring. Ireland was again, going back to the historical bit and perhaps educating those who don't remember those times. Ireland was exceptionally poor then. The unemployment and immigration rates were horrific. You know, huge amounts of people living in real poverty, and any sort of job losses created terrible hardship in the towns and cities in which they were suffered. So a meeting was held in the context of, we're looking at a global reorganization, which of course is code for we can move your jobs. And then followed up with, this is the amount of tax we would like to pay. So, you know, it was very much putting, you know, at that time, a very poorly resourced revenue commissions, a poorly resourced Irish state in a very, very difficult position. But the problem with when you've ended up in that sort of position and you've agreed these sorts of rates is you've created a precedent. And part of the defence Ireland had to the state aid case, and of course the state aid case, as Brian says, isn't about what's right. It's about very specific rules around state aid. But part of the defence of the Irish state was it wasn't state aid, or it didn't fall foul of state aid because it wasn't selective. And it wasn't selective because here's a selection of other multinationals where we've done similar sort of agreements. And it was really interesting from that how haphazard it is. The lack of science seems to be persisting well past the 80s and into the 90s and more recently. And it does suggest that sort of the path dependency created by giving in to that perhaps perceived initial threat that was there. But Ireland's in a much different place now. And you would hope that, you know, these things getting exposed, that we would be moving on to a situation where we'll be leaving those behaviours behind. The story told is really interesting. What is perhaps more interesting is, you know, are we willing, are all those involved willing to sort of dust ourselves down and take a different path from here on in?
Okay, thanks very much, Mary. And why other people might permit that kind of behaviour is something we'll come back to very shortly. Thanks, Mary. Sorry, do you want to come in there?
Yeah. Essentially, the most important point, I think, is that this is a structure that was available to everybody, all multinationals that were able to, you know, get it together to avail of it. It wasn't preferential treatment. The only thing that was really proved by the ruling was that the competition commissioner was the wrong commission through which to pursue this. And on the question of damages, what damage it has been done to Ireland, I think unquestionably Ireland's reputation has been damaged by it, regardless of the final outcome and the next appeal. Every time that I go away, or every time that I used to go away to talk about tax justice issues across Europe or beyond, without fail, Ireland is viewed as a bona fide, a straight up tax haven, without question. And I think that comes as quite a surprise to people living in Ireland who have intentionally or unintentionally been drinking the Kool-Aid. Ireland is recognized across the world as a tax haven. So yeah, I think that the Apple thing had just only added to people's general impression of Ireland.
Yeah. No, I think it's an important point that Sorty made there with, you know, with Bran as well, how what was really a kind of an issue of unfair competition between countries, between corporations was repackaged in the appeal as something else. I mean, just move the discussion on, because this is something, I mean, just following on from what Sorty has just said, I mean, the language is very interesting, it's very vivid in the book. And words such as collusion, in particular, word that I think there's almost fall out of usage, and that would be a shame. The word connivance is used with some regularity in the book about the connivance between various kind of vested interests, one being the Irish state. But towards the end of the book, Kieran and Bran refer to Ireland as, paraphrasing here, a rogue state whose entire kind of development strategy is based upon other countries not recognizing it as a rogue state. Do you want to kind of say a little bit more about that? maybe start this time with Kieran, and maybe also just in terms of really interesting thing that Mary said there, you know, in terms of legitimizing the strategy in the context of, say, for example, the 1980s or the 1990s, Ireland is one of the poorest countries in the rich world. Sometimes when you look at this, you can think, well, you could understand why the Irish state has done it, why it's been permitted by other more powerful forces such as the European Union isn't quite as apparent. Kieran, do you want to maybe talk about that idea of Ireland as a rogue state?
Well, I think, first of all, that Ireland is a very small state in terms of global capitalism, and for many years, it essentially flew under the radar. But as the, if you like, reliance on foreign direct investment came to rely more on the tax dodging strategy, that obviously has come to the attention of countries like France and Germany. And they are also experiencing, particularly after COVID and even before that, what you might call a fiscal crisis. How are they going to raise funds? And therefore, they're beginning to ask, why can't we take some of the taxes that Ireland is getting? So I think that is a dynamic that's come into play. I mean, in terms of the Irish operation as a rogue state, I mean, I'll just say two things. Number one, notice how the legacy of colonialism is turned around and used by the right wing. In other words, because we were oppressed, because we are poor, we have a right to rob the people of Ghana of taxes or rob the poor of America of taxes. Why? I mean, it's particularly a nationalist, anti-colonial form of reading. So it's not a particular argument that I accept, that people have a right to do that. And secondly, also note how the Irish state very much, you know, it very much sees itself as helping business. You know, the phrase, we are open for business. It's business as usual. The fact that, for example, you turn on your radio in the morning and you hear the business news, you never hear the trade union news and so on. The culture of this country is very much geared to supporting business. And just in case people think it is all about multinationals, when you look at the figures for Irish corporations, what do you find? You find that of the 200,000 registered companies in Ireland, about only a small proportion of them pay tax, right? Actually pay tax. I mean, obviously some companies aren't necessarily in business all the time, but only a small proportion pay tax, and 3/4 of those who pay tax pay less than 10,000 a year, according to the figures in 2018. So the whole ethos in this country is the state is there to help business, not necessarily workers or citizens to have proper public services, but it's really there to help business. And it seems to me that has led to a culture where Ireland somehow thinks that it has a right, because of its colonial past, its so-called poverty, to rob poorer countries of valuable tax resources.
Thanks, Kieran. Brian, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I do. Just the first thing I would say is that I think it's important to, when you talk about the rogue state, there are two ways I would approach it. Number one, it's good to link the role of Ireland and its tax evasion strategy to the wider development of neoliberalism, I think. And the idea that, you know, governments must be responsive to shareholder value effectively, that the main thing you need to do is to ensure that rich people are well looked after. That's the essence of neoliberalism. And they use international movements of capital to discipline workers, to threaten governments, just exactly like Mary just said. I mean, let's tell the truth. That's blackmail. You know, the point of it is that if we want access to a job, you have to allow us to avoid our taxes. You know, everyone else must pay. You know, the cleaners in the office have to pay. Anyone who turns 18 in the state has to pay, but very rich people don't have to pay, and we're not going to pay. That's the argument that they're making. And so, you know, if you think about it, over the last 30 or 40 years, as Ireland has become one of the world's preeminent tax havens, it has also fed into, you know, the dominance of a neoliberal policymaking framework that has had, for example, a massive increase in inequality in the world, therefore a lot more, anxiety for people, insecurity for people in their lives. It has led to a productivity gap where workers are not being rewarded for the work they're doing at the same rate as they were before this explosion of tax havens and neoliberalism. But they're both connected to the same general process. So that's one side of the coin. The other thing is that, you know, this is much more technical and much more localized. For about 10 or 15 years, the Irish state ran a lobbying group for the International Financial Services Centre in the department of the Taoiseach. Now, rich people always lobby. I think there's about 35,000 lobbyists in Brussels, and there's only 6,000 or 7,000 people working for the Commission. So there's always been lobbyists, but rarely does a government actually implement a strategy that puts the lobby group into the department of the Taoiseach. And there's been freedom of information, that has shown things like right in the depths of the crisis, when the Irish state was taking money off single parents, off travellers, closing down all sorts of schemes that would get people back to work, hammering the poorest and the most vulnerable people in our society. They were creating all sorts of harebrained tax schemes to get rich people to get more tax breaks. For example, send your children to private schools, we'll give you a tax break. Come back to Ireland, we'll give you 35% off your high taxes up to a point of 75,000. This was all happening in the same budgets that they were cutting other people's living standards. So that to us would be a rogue state, internally because it undermines democracy, and externally because it puts its weight, whatever weight it does have, behind the American Chamber of Commerce, behind capitalist interests, and behind the broad project of neoliberalism, which undermines democracy globally and undermines our capacity to control our lives in any form of democratic way.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. Of course, one of the meetings during that period between kind of big financial interests and the state is one for which we have no minutes, the one that produced the bank guarantee. Can I just bring Miri in again? Miri, anything that you would like to add or contest? Or
I think the rogue state idea is an interesting one, in that, like, sorely, I get to go abroad every now and then on tax. Pre-COVID, you'd be going to conferences and all the rest, and people go, oh, Ireland, and they want to talk about tax havens and they want to talk about Apple. So there is that perception abroad, definitely. But it's interesting how, in terms of policy coherence within the Irish government, like the Irish government, the Department of Foreign Affairs, are so proud of our oversized role in human rights worldwide, in our peacekeeping role, in our support of certain particularly sub-Saharan countries that Irish aid supports. And there's this absolute lack of policy coherence between the two. And I was looking today, just reminding myself of Ireland's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And one of the key themes that keeps emerging from it was to ensure policy coherence. And for some reason, and tax doesn't really get a mention, financial issues don't get a mention directly. It's like the technical language we have around tax and trade sort of puts this protective bubble around it, that people don't get engaged with how the policies there interact with the other policies. And we very much, I'm doing my PhD in the Irish Centre for Human Rights. When you look at the list of, human rights experts worldwide, special rapporteurs on human rights, like Ireland is so overrepresented. I mean, we've such fantastic expertise there. And yet we have this other side where we also have this global reputation as a tax haven. And recently the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have said that they will be, one of the questions they will be raising with the Irish government when they're up to their next periodic review is the issue of how Ireland's tax policies impact on countries like Ghana, an example which Brian had used there. So, it's not a victimless policy.
Which is actually something we're going to come back to in a moment. Thanks very much for that, Miri. Yeah, I mean, and it's also interesting, one of the things that comes up in the book, and Kieran kind of alluded to it there earlier, that quite often these debates are kind of shrouded in some kind of the mysteries of the expertise of these particular groups of specialists who know these things that we don't know. But one of the examples you give in the book is of the World Bank basically devising kind of tax policy on the basis of a fictitious ceramics factory, something that was just plucked out of thin air, remarkably incompetent. Can I just bring Sorley in there, please? Sorley, anything to add at that point?
No, I don't think so. In the interest of time, Colin, the only thing I would add is, I mean, it's very difficult to give a definition of what a rogue state is, but I don't think it should be very far from a state that actively deploys policies that result in countries across the world not being able to provide public services that can lead to the death of children and people. That would be, to me, a pretty effective working definition of a rogue state, and that is in fact what Ireland is doing.
Well, let's maybe just continue that theme and maybe start with you, Sorley, because we'll bring people in about 10 minutes time. I know there's some questions already. We'll open this up to for discussion in about 10 minutes time. But I wanted to, this idea, and there's a kind of quotidian version of this, an everyday version of this, of sure, if we had the opportunity ourselves to avoid tax, we'd all do the same. There's this nod and a wink kind of everyday kind of version of this as though it were a victimless crime. But some of the figures that are given in the book, that Oxfam's estimate that 8 million children in the underdeveloped world die every year as a result of tax evasion, possibly as much as $160 billion of resources that could be used for hospitals and creches and all the rest, being siphoned out of the underdeveloped world. Even really interesting last night, Jim Stewart from Trinity on prime time talking about the estimate of, as a minimum, I think the figure he gave was 130 billion of dark money from Russia passing through the FSC every year, the ways in which we're connected to that particular moment of crisis. Shorty, do you want to give people a sense of how this isn't a victimless crime, perhaps in a global rather than a domestic context?
Yeah, I mean, that's what brought me and Christian Aid into this issue back in 2008. It was really looking at the effect of multinational tax dodging across the world, and essentially that it was depriving developing countries of revenue that they needed to deliver public services. And I'm always loath to draw a direct line between, tax dodged and lives lost. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch to do that. And I think we can all agree that the people being deprived of public services isn't a good thing. We campaigned for a long time to get the government to do something about this. And it was really, at the beginning, we were getting absolutely nowhere, and they denied that there was any possibility of being a link between developing countries losing revenue and Irish tax policy. But I think it's interesting that they finally conceded to carry out a spillover analysis, which is essentially a look at whether or not Irish tax policy was undermining the tax take of developing countries. And predictably, their spillover analysis concluded that there wasn't sufficient linkages between developing countries and Ireland to have any impact at all. So basically, they give themselves a free pass on it. We did a subsequent follow-up piece that showed that piece of work to be conceptually and methodologically flawed. And we showed that there was very real linkages between the developing world and Ireland. I mean, it's ludicrous to think that in the globalized economy that we operate in, that there wouldn't be linkages between the developing countries and the global financial center that Ireland has become. But this is an argument that the Department of Finance has really strongly held onto. And I think it's really interesting that this is, I think, the vulnerable point in the Department of Finance and the government as a whole. They do not like to have this incoherent policy, as Mary has pointed out to them. They really, their human rights record and then their development program is one of their soft powers that they use internationally. So when we have taken them to task about it and showed that in fact policies in other parts of the state are undermining that program, it is a very sensitive issue, and they've reacted very strongly and critically in reaction to that. And as Mary said, that's been taken now to a UN committee. So I think, this is something that I think if we look to the future as to how we might leverage some kind of change in policy, I definitely think this is an area that I think represents a vulnerability in the Irish kind of approach to their tax policy.
Okay, sorry, it's really interesting. Thank you. Mary, have you anything to add there? I mean, in terms of domestically, internationally,
I suppose we've just to be careful, though, not to overstate Ireland's role and their size. The double Irish existed for years, not only because of Irish legislation, but the US could have closed it off at any time and didn't. The US, particularly Delaware, are huge tax havens themselves. So a lot of the role Ireland could play here is more, it's about policy coherence, it's about being consistent in what we say. But I wouldn't like us to get to sort of work on the basis that, if Ireland changed its tack, everything would be good in the world. Not at all. We do have more international cooperation happening at the moment. But the flip side of that is, because Ireland's, I suppose, relatively small, there are small measures we could take, which wouldn't necessarily result in a lot of loss of revenue for us, but would be seen and very much welcomed, particularly by our development partners in sub-Saharan Africa, the countries like Ghana and Malawi that Ireland supports. But all the problem with tax havenery doesn't lie with Ireland, and the solution doesn't lie with us alone either.
Yeah, and one of the really key points I think that the Brian and Kieran make in the book is that decision, and like so many of the kind of calamities that befell the global economy and over the last 25 years was made during the Clinton administration. That decision in 1996 to change the rules around where American multinationals could actually disclose, register their profits and avoid taxes. I'm kind of conscious we're getting close towards the end of this kind of period. We may take another 5 minutes and we can wrap up. I mean, this issue of a victim, and I want to bring one last issue in, but I'll invite Kieran and Brian maybe to address this question, and maybe also to respond to those issues of the victimless crime, of the impact of, because one of the things that you draw out very well is the way in which the vulture funds are part of this particular narrative, and the impact in everybody's lives have been, many people's lives has been catastrophic, not least here in North Kildare, which is very much in the belly of the beast in terms of the crisis of vulture funds in Ireland. But can I pose one last question, which is, are we in a different world now that Ireland has apparently signed up to this new OECD deal, where supposedly firms that are producing a certain amount of output a year are going to pay 15% of their profits in tax? So maybe Brian and Kieran, can I ask you to respond back to that question about the kind of the social and political impact of tax evasion on ordinary people, and also maybe look forward to, are we in a different era? Maybe if we could start with you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I suppose, as you say, one of the most direct impacts on ordinary people is via the collapse of the economy. And one of the things we try to explain in the book is that, as you said yourself, tax policy can often be something that people find, on the one level infuriating, but on the other level just something that they don't want to engage in. It's quite technical and so on. And people might sometimes feel there's a parallel universe where, they don't like that the rich are doing this. Most people, if you ask them, do they like what Ireland is doing? Do they think it's fair? They'll say no. Do they think it should continue? Is a more complicated question. They definitely don't think it's fair, but they often wonder, is it in our interest, But the point is that what people sometimes miss is that Irish people pay some of the highest mortgages in Europe. They pay, I think, second highest rents in Europe now. They're much more vulnerable and insecure. Their public services are much worse. So in a certain sense, you would say, look, if you're going to judge a tax haven on the basis of, Ireland Inc., wouldn't you expect that Ireland, with all this vast money flowing through, would be at the top of the league tables for quality of life, for housing access, for, operations, for pupil-teacher ratios, all that stuff? Ireland's at the bottom of all those lists. And one of the people asks, who benefits from this? Well, I'll tell you who benefits. There are a couple of 100,000 people who work out of either directly or indirectly the IFSC, who facilitate a lot of this stuff. If you look at the tax units in Ireland, there's well over 200,000 tax units, either single people or married, who are earning over 100,000 euros, and their average annual income is 190,000. So there's lots of rich people. That's one thing. Then there's the developers. In the aftermath of the crash, we all know about NAMA. What people don't know maybe as much is that they brought in this guy called John Moran, who was the CEO of Zurich Capital, a very strange fella to bring into the state and conservative Department of Finance. But why did they bring him in? Well, he had a track record of being involved in finance and being involved in lobbying. And when he was the CEO of the company, it had been fined for inside dealing, right? That's all fact. Now, what we do know is that over the next 2 years, this guy at the helm brought vulture funds to the table 65 times to have direct face-to-face meetings with officials from the Department of Finance. And what we know after that is hundreds of billions of Irish assets, land, assets, public and private assets, mainly private and mainly around Dublin, were sold off to vulture funds. And one of the sweeteners for doing that was tax-free profits through the IFSC. Remember I said at the start about the loan manipulation. what's happened is the Sunday Business Post, UCD Social Science have all been lots of reports that have shown that because these companies basically came in at a time when the property market had collapsed, they got in at the bottom, they got monopolized more or less the land base, and the only land that's still available is public land. Now, the Irish state could be building, I think it's on 800 parcels of land, but they are choosing not to. Why? Because if they do, they go in direct competition with the companies that they've promised that they won't build. You know, so what we have is a deliberate policy of supply lagging demand in order to reflate the property market, which was so important to the Irish rich, in order to reflate values in terms of land and so on, and crucially to get profits moving again in that sector. Now, of course, some ordinary people have benefited from that in terms of negative equity, but the point is, why have we got record levels of people waiting on houses? Why are we paying record levels of rent? And why are we paying record levels of mortgages? The elites would like you to believe these are forces beyond their control. They're not. They're direct consequences of their deliberately conscious actions to try and reflate the property market and to give it over to vulture funds who, amongst other things, got tax-free profits. So that's a really important thing. And the other point I just wanted to make, and I do really thank Mary for coming in with her perspective, but I just want to say one thing about Ireland's role in all of this, because actually, you know, one of the narratives is that we're often a victim, that there's like these big international forces and we're caught, you know, there's a mismatch in legal that we couldn't foresee. The truth of it is, if you look back, when the Americans changed the law to allow companies to declare their profits overseas, the Irish state was the first of all the countries to actually respond to that by making it possible to declare yourself a legal resident in Ireland, but not legally resident for tax. Now, Colin, how can you be legally resident in Ireland and not pay your tax in Ireland as an ordinary citizen? You can't. So why were companies given that privilege? That wasn't a mismatch. That was a deliberate action. And so Ireland is really in the foreground of this kind of stuff. And the very final point I'll make before I give it over to Kieran is, look at how they acted in the recent stuff around the OECD. That was an opportunity, albeit that I would say it was an overblown sort of media, you know, the rhetoric was overblown, but there was some opportunity to hold companies to account. What did the Irish government do? They held out and held out until future democratic governments were constrained that they couldn't increase taxes on the biggest companies in the world more than 15%. And then Pascal Donoghue comes home and celebrates that fact and says, great day for Ireland. We've secured the fact that around the world, the richest companies will never pay more than 15%. Great victory. Well, I'm sorry, that to me is a great loss to the vast majority of people in the world who could do with a bit more money, and it could be taken from the big companies who are constantly exploiting people's labor.
Thanks very much, Brian. Kieran, are you, I mean, there's a hint of kind of muted optimism in the very end of the book. Muted, I would emphasize muted because you do talk about there's at least now a possibility of some proper policy around, say, transferred pricing and so on. Would you be more optimistic than when you began the book that perhaps we're moving towards a less unfair system of corporate tax?
Well, I think we've kind of entered an era where there's a massive gap between rhetoric and action. So Greta Thunberg's blah, blah, blah. Then you actually look what they're doing on climate change. The Irish state is a master of this. I mean, it has the progressive, Mary's pointed out, the progressive record on human rights, but at the same time, it is robbing people across the world, or facilitating the robbery of people across the world. So I think we always have to look behind the rhetoric, is the point I'm making. And George Orwell probably had it right when he talked about we've entered an era of, you know, white is black and black is white. So when we actually look at the 15%, let me just make some specific points. Number one, the Irish government joined that having removed the term only 15%. So it's just 15% at the moment. Secondly, the OECD rate on the 15%, one of the quid pro quos was removing the idea of a digital tax. So a digital tax means that you would tax, for example, Facebook on its sales in Germany as against its booking through Ireland. And thirdly, and this is the key point, the issue is 15% of what? Of gross profits, of taxable income and so on. And therefore you come to what the Irish government wants to do is it wants to present itself as a respectable tax haven, unlike Bermuda. So it's inside at the negotiating table, and it will be there to ensure that as many loopholes are left, deliberate loopholes, as left as possible to ensure that the actual taxable, in other words, the money that's declared to the revenue commissioners minus the allowances, that takes you well below 15%. So, Colin, I mean, yes, it does cause some problems for them, but I think they are adept and are acute and think that they will be able to salvage the tax haven by being at the negotiating table of the OECD.
Thanks, Kieran. And one of the things you point out in the book, of course, is that one of the many reasons for being in the inside of the tent is the OECD has never listed one of its members as a tax haven. Miri, would you like to a kind of final kind of wrap up word, maybe specifically about are we heading towards a brave new world of some, you know, less unfair system of corporation tax?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, everything Kieran has said there is correct. And as you mentioned, you know, the forum is the OECD, but the OECD is a rich countries club and obviously is going to take care of its own interests. But I'm actually quite optimistic in that round 2 of this OECD process, so the minimum corporation tax rate as a start, and how exactly that will pan out, we've yet to see. But when they started the first BEPS process, nobody expected this round 2. The way it was spoken about, sort of tax sovereignty was still central. They were not going to go messing with that. They were not a forum to go introducing minimum tax rates. And yet that happened. And there's been a huge movement on that. So why did that happen? Why did they not give up after BEPS 1? And it's to do with public opinion. It's to do with the amazing reporting that has come out in the various LuxLeaks, the Credit Suisse story and so forth. It's about the public continuing to say, still not good enough, we're not happy. And if the public interest in tax stories can be maintained, I think there's still a lot of progress that can be made.
Thanks very much, Mary. Sorley?
Yeah, I mean, what you're getting there is a pretty good flavour of where the tax justice movement is in its assessment of the BEPS process. Some would have you believe that it is a really good thing to have achieved a minimum global corporation tax rate, and also to have some kind of formula reapportionment, which moves away from this arm's length principle that Brian was talking about. On the other hand, what we got was very, very, very poor, very, very weak. It's the 15% is unlikely to deter people from the kind of profit shifting that we've seen. And also for pillar 1, it's very unclear as to how they are going to assess the profit that they're going to deduct this 20% from. That isn't clear yet. What kind of carve-outs, what kind of exemptions, what kind of things will not be applied when they're considering what profit to tax. And those kind of things are now being teased out in the corridors of the OECD. And the devil will be in the detail of that. So we do not know yet as to what that will look like. And you can bet your sweet bippy that Ireland is heavily represented in those corridors, making sure that many of the structures that few people know about that are maintaining Ireland's attraction as a tax haven will be maintained into a post-BEPS world.
Okay, Sorley, thank you very, very much. Thanks to all our contributors. I want to throw it open to some discussion now. We've got some questions coming in. I think some of the questions, without wanting to avoid any questions, there's some I think that were possibly answered in the subsequent discussion. One here from Liam Roach, who asked, are the panel not suggesting that Apple was given special treatment? The court has found that they were not. I think Brian's point was that Apple was far from unique in the various forms of it was among a whole host of multinational corporations so that were given comparable treatment, although Apple's may have been a particularly extreme case. Willie Cumming, so who benefits? Obviously the multinationals do, but who benefits from this in Ireland? And what is the downside for everyone else? Again, interesting question. I think again one of those ones that we've certainly touched on. I mean, one of the things that Kieran and Brad said in the book, that the difference between a kind of a fair kind of corporation tax regime in Ireland and the one that actually exists is about 6,000 million euros for the Irish revenue. So the Irish state at a certain version of things benefits, but of course, as Kieran and Brian and others have pointed out, We live in a country which doesn't even have the most basic standards of public provision. Can I bring in Barry Cannon here? Barry, my colleague Barry Cannon from Politics here in Maynooth. Good to see you, hear from you, Barry. Hope you're well. Despite the injustice of all of this, I don't sense a feeling of indignation about it among the general population. What can explain that? If it is indeed the case. Let's see, Kieran, what do you think about that question? Do you think there is a sense of indignation?
I think that the idea that we have 12.5% has been hegemonic, to use that phrase, over many decades in Ireland. And I think Brian has made the point in other meetings that a school child in Ireland probably knows that we tax profits at the rate of 12.5%, but they probably don't know the name of many birds or wild animals and so on at this stage. So, I mean, it has been really drummed into the population, 12.5%. Now, I think there's been, I mean, in trying to deal with this argument, I mean, I've attempted to reframe it in a number of ways. So you could ask the question, and it's a valid question, why should a person who's cleaning Google's offices, why should they be paying more as a proportion of their income than Google itself? And when you ask that question to people, people say, well, that is not fair. I tend to agree with you. Another way of phrasing the question is to say, well, if a worker, even on a minimum income, is paying 20% at a certain point, why shouldn't a corporation pay at least 20%? Now, I think that the way I'd put it is, yes, it is hegemonic. That is the reason. There's no denial that. Even Sinn Féin, who purports to be a left-wing party, for example, most recently said that they were just about for raising the 15%. So it is obviously hegemonic in Irish society. But for those of us on the left, obviously we're trying to chip away at this. We're trying to make the argument. And crucially, we're making the argument, as well as internationalism, you also have to make the argument in terms of self-interest, because capitalism teaches you to be aware of your own self-interest. And the way I would put it is, in addition to what Brian said, we have very poor public services, but it's also the case that Irish workers pay relatively high rates of tax. We pay a 40% rate of tax sooner, and when you add in the USC, it's higher than that. We pay that sooner than other countries do around the world. So I think that we have to make the argument consistently and point out to people that the mass of people are paying relatively high rates of tax for very poor public services, and there's something very much rotten in the whole system of tax haven Ireland. We have a way to go, but I think we've started the argument.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Sorley, would you like to also?
Yeah, I would. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is when I'm listening to this is, you know, and you referred to it very early on, was that the money washing through Ireland, and you know, it just passes by. It doesn't even get Ireland wet, as Sheila Killian likes to say.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really important thing, because there are many other things in the Irish tax code that are not unique to Ireland, but that play a really important role in Ireland's tax haven status. Many other countries offer the same kinds of things. Now, arguably Ireland's, you know, entire package of offerings make it unique. But there's loads of things that they share with other countries, but there's definitely something about the enabling environment, the unspoken word, the implicit welcome or confidence that multinationals can take by locating themselves in Ireland, that they won't be challenged on their transfer pricing aspects, that they won't be challenged on their various structures that they put in place, that they know that in advance. That's a very hard thing to document. It's a very hard thing to give any proof for. But to me, it's kind of the thing that kind of looms large. It's the elephant in the room for all of this, because there are things that don't make sense. The fact that, you know, we don't levy withholding tax on royalties that leave the country. Now, why don't we? That would be great. There's so much leaving the country, we can make a killing out of that. But you know, there was a counter lobby to ensure that we don't levy withholding tax on it, just to make it a more comfortable, warm environment for multinationals. So it's unless we can kind of challenge that kind of enabling an environment that says we can do something different, we can create a different structure whereby we aren't utterly reliant on this. That's going to be the dominant, prevalent kind of almost, you know, environment in which this is all happening. And that to me is quite distressing. And yeah, I just would love to be able to get behind that, to some of the closed meetings that perhaps happen between the Department of Finance and the IDA, or the Enterprise Ireland and Revenue. But yeah.
Thanks very much, Sorry. I mean, one of the pieces of research I think done out in UCD, Sam Brazzi's and Aidan Regan, they went and interviewed, senior executives in kind of multinational corporations. One of the things that they did say was a sense of, well, look, Ireland has been creating this environment for us for so long that we assume that it will go on. One of the reasons we will stick here is that we know that essentially, to put it crudely, they will do our bidding, or that they will facilitate our interests. And it's that, I mean, because obviously the Apple deals go back to 1991. This is almost prehistoric for in terms of the development of the state. Thanks very much, Sorley. I'll bring Miriam Bryan in maybe with the next question. I should say there's a few questions that were asked probably at various stages that I think were kind of addressed in the discussion that unfolded subsequently. So without wishing to be disrespectful to people, I might just maybe skip some of those while mentioning them. But there's a really interesting one here coming in from Declan White, and Declan asks this: do the latest EU sanctions prevent Russian finance flows via the IFSC, or can the Irish state continue to facilitate these flows circumventing these sanctions? I mentioned earlier, trying to kind of link things together, that in last night's prime time, Jim Stewart from TCD was followed immediately by the Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, who was remarkably timid and evasive in his comments, and those two things may have been connected. But Brian and Miri, do you want to respond to that about the importance of IFSC as a conduit, as a haven for these forms of from many countries, not just Russia, but specifically in this context, obviously with what's happening in Eastern Ukraine, Russian dirty money going through the centre of Dublin? Brian, maybe first, and then Miri.
Yeah. Well, look, as you said, I did happen to catch that last night, where Simon Coveney, on the one hand, is very vociferous in his defence of NATO when he's talking geopolitically, but when it comes to actually a bit closer to home, he was asked a direct question: will you now stop the money flowing through the IFSC? And he said no. He said that he wasn't actually asked it that way. He was asked it slightly different. He said, will the various sanctions mean that money stops flowing through the IFSC? And he said, no, it won't. And then he went on to qualify it, but that was exactly what he said. So the point of it is that, and Nicholas Shaxson has written a very good book. I can't remember, was it Tax Havens and the Men Who Stole the World, it's called. And he makes a point in there that says, look, the war on terror, the war on drugs, all this kind of stuff is deeply hypocritical, because actually the elites of the world have set up all these shadows. Why do we have a banking system in the world that's bigger than the official banking system, right? There's been about something like 187 trillion lent outside the normal channels, in the shadows, non-regulated money. We know, for example, that Ireland, with about the 45th biggest economy in the world, has the 4th biggest shadow banking system down in the Docklands. What's going on down there? Well, one thing we definitely know is that Russian oligarchs are sending criminal money out of Russia on a process called round tripping, where it goes out into the IFSC. They use special purpose vehicles in the IFSC to repackage that money and send it back in as foreign direct investment, so that it basically cleans it for them. That's what's happening, right? And you've got that happening in all sorts of ways, right? You go back and you look at Mary mentioned things like the Lux leaks and the Panama leaks and all the rest of it. When you cross-reference drug gangs, when you cross-reference the mafia, for example, against tax havens, they couldn't exist without them, because all of the laundering that happens in the world happens through tax havens. And so what you have is in the one sense, the 0.001% who disproportionately benefit from these forms of institutions, they tolerate everything else because everything else is tolerable when you're using these mechanisms. So it's deeply hypocritical in lots of ways, and it shows how morally bankrupt in lots of ways capitalism is at the moment. Yeah, I think that's the answer to your question. But if I just say one thing about the very, very important question that was asked previously by Barry, that is the very difficult question. And the one thing I'd say is, look, as you said yourself there, Colin, you ask any corporate executive, are they happy broadly with the way Irish policymaking has happened over the last 10, 15 years? They'll all say yes. Go into estates in Tala, where I'm from, and ask the same question to the ordinary person in the estate. Are you happy with the way policy making has gone in this state over the last 10 or 15 years? And increasingly people will say no. Why have we had historic levels of shift away from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? Because people increasingly recognize that they're being sold a pig in a poke. Now, that does not necessarily mean that they have an articulated view of the tax haven, but they do recognize the effects of the tax haven on an increasingly difficult life. And I think our responsibility as people who do know a little bit more about the technical detail is to raise the specter of change and to say, listen, we need to realize the reason why life is hard for people is because of these policies. Because as Kieran said, the hegemony of their argument is Ireland Inc. pull on the green jersey. And what we've to say is actually there is no green jersey. The jersey only fits the top 1 or 2 or 5%, and the rest of us have to suffer because of it. So I think I've got some optimism there, but it's not the optimism of the OECD or the international elites to regulate. I've got more of a sense that the population itself is becoming increasingly tired with the kind of policy making that flows from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. Miri, do you want to add to that just about that specific question? That just a lot of people are thinking about because of the sanctions that are muted, the sanctions that are going to be imposed on Russia, which seem very, very timid in the context of Britain, at least. Have you any opinions on that?
No, unfortunately, not my area. I'm not an expert in it, but I do think it's interesting how, I mentioned earlier the traditional idea of a tax haven, how that's evolved. But the traditional idea of a tax haven was the Swiss bank accounts, places that were hiding, stolen Nazi loot and the wealth of, South American dictators. Ireland's always been able to distance itself from that sort of image of a tax haven. And now, as you said, we're seeing this view of sort of the Russian money being laundered and facilitated by us. And maybe we're not a million miles from that perception, or not as far from it as we thought we were.
Thanks very much, Mary.
Sorry, Colin, just wanted to jump in. It's just on that. Just to add to that, the lads make it very clear in the book, and it's a very strong part, Ireland's reluctance and unwillingness to sign up to the kinds of measures at international levels, in this case at a European level, that would tackle this kind of thing. And I'm specifically thinking about the fourth anti-money laundering directive and the fifth one, where they had to be basically hauled before the European Court of Justice before they signed up to the bloody thing. It took them years before they wanted to do it. And part of that was to introduce a register of the true flesh and blood owners of companies that would throw some light onto who actually was behind these kind of Russian dolls of, phantom companies. But Ireland was so slow and had to be forced to do that. That's the kind of thing that, whether it's intentional or not, really sends out a very negative impression of what Ireland's commitments are to transparency and tackling the kind of money laundering and terrorism that we're talking about now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stuart. I think it's that at various stages in the book, I think particularly towards the end, I think Kieran and Brian say something about this three-headed sequence of delaying, avoidance, and dilution. This strategy of just kicking the can down the road as long as possible, and then of course essentially trying to mute the impact. And they give several examples of that. I'm conscious we're running close to the end here. I just want to bring a couple of questions in. I'm noticing there, I just a comment from Nessa Casera, who's among many other things a PhD student out here in Maynooth, and I think Nessa's question, which was about what's going to happen next, we did actually come to at the end, but I just want seeing her name there reminds me that this time last night, she and I were both in a kind of a Zoom conversation about a particular project to dramatize the housing crisis in Ireland called The Apology, which is an attempt to, I suppose, use more imaginative and kind of arts-based kind of attempts to kind of talk about the various kind of crises of public funding in Ireland. So I will send that round to everybody afterwards. It's on Vimeo, and it's definitely well worth it. Very, very powerful piece of art. Stroke politics. Suming had a couple of comments there. Suming Koo from out in Galway had a couple of comments. And maybe just bring in her also. There's actually Liam Roach's question disappeared, but it was an interesting one. So if I can remember it off the top of my head, I might. Suming says, reflecting on Sorty's point about targeting Ireland's soft power, it seems that the more Ireland and its shelter corporations get away with the more fragile and sensitive officials and companies get, leading them to imagine that not just is this a victimless crime, they are the victims, that they've been unfairly criticized and defamed, turning the critique upside down, which, in a way, perhaps that's one of the things that Kieran was talking about, the way in which that a certain post-colonial mentality is mobilized to create an exceptional status. We're allowed to do this because we were colonized. We're allowed to do this because we had the famine. We were allowed to do this because we were poor for so long. Sorty, it was your name was mentioned, or
just on that, it is interesting. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Department of Finance call the shots in government, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Irish Aid are the very junior brother or sister in that relationship, and we know that intuitively, but we also know it from the Ireland-Ghana tax treaty example that's used in the book that actually came from Christian Aid. It was that advice came from the Department of Foreign Affairs not to go ahead with the treaty, that it would disadvantage Ghana, and that it wasn't going to be in their interest to go ahead. That was completely rode roughshod by the Department of Finance and Revenue, who saw this as an opportunity to extend and enhance the business opportunities for Irish companies. So that was just that's a really good example of whereby the Department of Foreign Affairs are left holding their hands going, what can we do? Department of Finance are really in charge here.
Okay, thank you very much, Sorty. We're almost out of time. Maybe if I could just bring in one last thing, which was Liam Roach had mentioned a couple of things, one of which I think was really dealt with in the subsequent discussion after he posted it. But he also mentioned something which has now disappeared, but if I can remember it off the top of my head, basically said that Ireland is receiving something like 15 billion in corporation tax. How does that square with the argument that tax avoidance depletes public services in Ireland? I mean, it wouldn't be fair to paraphrase it, but I think the gist of the quiz, I'm about to anyway, the gist of the question seems to be, are we not beneficiaries of this particular system? The corporation tax has expanded enormously over the last decade. Maybe we could run around back through everybody, starting with Mary, and maybe even any final thoughts, and then we can wrap things up. Mary, if we could take you first.
No, a fair point from Liam. Our corporation tax receipts the last number of years have been phenomenal. They come from a very small number of companies, but what you see when you look sort of in great detail, and in many ways, they have insulated Ireland to a good extent against the COVID crisis. But what you will see if you look sort of dig down in detail into how they are treated by the state is very much, there's an acknowledgement that these are artificially high and they are not being used to be invested in ongoing education, health, and so forth, because we know that the plug is going to be pulled on those partially due to the OECD reforms. And I suppose it just sort of reminds me a little bit, tying in with some comments earlier about the difference between how business is treated and its needs centred compared to individuals, be that at the tax rate or other. The key point Ireland always has is about business certainty and keeping the tax rate stable for business certainty, because businesses or incorporated fictional legal entities, we prioritise that over the certainty of humans, the certainty of families who are waiting on scoliosis treatments for their children, the certainty of that cleaner working in Google who doesn't know if her family income supplement will be increasing or decreasing next year. The certainty of the tax rates, and look, I've got a good job, but what tax rate will I be paying next year? Why don't I get the same certainty that the business does? But interestingly, the Department of Finance does know that they can't rely with certainty on these, what are seen as basic windfall corporation tax receipts. So we're not really getting that invested, and we can't. That's actually a wise move on their part.
Thank you very much, Mary. Maybe Kieran, if we could take you next.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that one of the features of a tax haven actually is that you can suck in quite a lot of companies which declare their profits in Ireland. So this point has been made by people like Gabriel Zuckman in his study. So it is true, corporation tax rates have increased in Ireland. A few caveats. Why is that the case? Because I think, as Mary said earlier on, there has been an emergence of a global opposition to tax havens. So to some extent, governments have to respond to that. And in particular, what that means is Ireland brands itself as a more respectable tax haven compared to Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. So there's been a shifting of money in that regard. In addition to that, I mean, the way the Irish state operates is that it presents this image, but in reality, even though the money is flowing in, it has flown in for particular reasons. For example, there's been a strategy of American companies in particular to use what's called inversions, taking over Irish companies, making sure there's about 20% shareholding of the so-called Irish-based companies. This has also attracted the money. So I'm not sure how long it's going to last, but obviously it is the case at the moment. But the main point to make is this, that even though corporate tax receipts have increased, the proportion of the tax take coming from PAY workers since the crash of 2008 has also increased dramatically. So while you hear RTE and so telling you, isn't it wonderful that we're getting so much corporate tax receipts in Ireland, what you're not being told, or rather it's not being highlighted, is that the actual allowances and so on for workers has been diminished, and as a result, the tax take for PAY workers has increased. And very lastly, as Mary's pointed out, even though the corporation tax receipts have increased, it doesn't mean that this has led to a massive expansion in the Irish public services in terms of housing, education. We still have the highest class sizes in Europe. We still have the highest university fees in Europe after Britain leaves. We have the highest bus fare, one of the highest bus fares. We have the highest childcare costs, you name it. So therefore, the actual receipts coming in are not necessarily going in benefit to the vast majority of the population.
Thanks, Kieran. Sorty?
Yeah, just everything that has been said, I agree with by the three others. I mean, my sense is that you know, the reliance, which it is on corporation tax receipts, does lead to policy and legislation being skewed towards the ongoing facilitation of that. And I think that is at the expense of small and medium enterprises and of other sectors of the community of our society that are much more dependent and need it better. So that would be my concern.
Thanks very much, Sorty. Last word with yourself, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. And I should actually say that the work from Christian A is excellent, and I would meant to say it on a few of my responses that we got a lot of detail from the work that you had done. So fair play. Look, I mean, the point is, and it's kind of revealing in some ways, because as Kieran said, I would say if we did a straw poll of relatively well-educated people in Ireland, a lot of them would know that the tax receipts have gone up. But you've got to ask yourself the question, why do they know that? Why is it that it's so prominent in our media that we have increased our corporate? So I'll ask, even as just a rhetorical question, does anybody here know by how much PAY workers paid? That's us. We're the ones who put that money in. How much did we pay into that system over the last year? And much less people know. But the fact of it is, it went from 25%, or about 12.5 billion in 2008, to 38%, or about 25 billion in the latest tax take. We've had record tax takes in the last ones, and it's the proportion that's come from working people is bigger. Even the increase is bigger than the increase that corporations paid. Second point I'd make is, even if there's 15 billion coming in from the corporate sector, you know, you got to see it in the round. Like Ireland gave away 60 billion to the banking sector recently because we are involved in all these kind of policies, you know, and that meant that the economy collapsed. And I would just say, in the end, I would dispute the idea that it's about we anyway. We didn't get anything. Until actual people are getting better services and a more secure life, you can't say that the tax system is working for us. It's working for certain groups within Ireland. So I would always dispute the idea that we are a homogenous, unified bloc. In the end, right, you have to say, is policy being implemented for the majority? And if you can say, you know, 2 or 3 or 400,000 people benefit from tax haven, I wouldn't disagree with that. That's true. But that makes about 2 out of every 25 people. What about the other 23 people? What about the people who can't eat, who are worried about their heating bills? And, you know, people say that that's always a rhetorical argument. That's real people. So in the end, for me, what we've got to argue is, what kind of republic do we want to live in? And the kind of republic I want to live in is not one that has set itself up to enrich the elites in Ireland and abroad, and at the expense of the poorest people in the world. That to me is a deeply immoral form of political economy, and we can do better than that. And so I would ask people to maybe read the book and to think very seriously about what we want to do about those things, because I think we have a moral duty, and we also have a self-interest in trying to form a much more democratic and progressive form of republic than we've had up until now. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Brian. If I could just wrap things up by, again, emphasising the book is out about 4 months, 5 months now. We've heard an awful lot about neoliberalization and so on, and the commodification and all of these processes. And one of the ways it expresses itself in higher education is, of course, academic books being published for 80, 90, £100 sterling. This book is available by a left-wing publishing house, Pluto. We've been around for many decades. I bought it in the bookshop on campus here for less than €14. It's affordable, it's accessible. I think it is genuinely a landmark in the development of a kind of left progressive political economy in Ireland historically. I think the left have been perhaps more adept at history and art and culture than they have necessarily in political economy. And I think that's something that has begun to change over the last dozen years or so. And I think this is, as I say, this is a signal of that. And I think it's a landmark in the development of a confident and competent kind of left political economy in Ireland. Just to say by conclusion, I'm going to be sending on a couple of things to everybody who kindly signed up for today's event. One will be this piece of art, very powerful piece of art. I won't attempt to describe it. You'll see it when you see it, which offers an autobiographical take on the housing crisis in Ireland, called The Apology, which I'll send around. I'll also send around a link from Willie Cumming where people can buy the book. And even if you don't agree with everything you've heard over the last 90 minutes, in fact, especially if you don't agree with everything you've heard over the last 90 minutes, please do buy the book and please do engage in the debate. Finally, also just to reiterate my thanks to Anne Hamilton-Black and Orla Dunn from Moosey in Maynooth, who have done an awful lot of the heavy carrying and the mechanics of putting today's event together. Thanks very much. I see we've had, there's still more than 40 people in the discussion, so I hope you enjoyed it, hope you got something from it, and hopefully this is not something that's going to go away. Obviously, two big stories around these issues in the last 4 days. Credit Suisse, and of course, as we're talking about kind of Russian dirty money passing through various centres of London and Dublin, not least. So this is a debate that's only going to gain legs over the years to come. So thanks very much to our speakers. Thanks very much to Brian and Kieran for putting together such an engaging and vivid and passionate book. And we'll just draw things to a close there. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Very much. See you. Very good.
Cheers.